I figure there's, for the last and hopefully the least speaker, there's one thing I've done more of than anybody in this room, I think, which is screw up. When I look back through 30 years of first starting my own companies and then being a venture capitalist, I would venture to guess I've screwed up more often than anybody in this room by a lot. So my hope today, and those of you who were here 2 years ago, I more talked about my personal story and how I came to do what I did. This year, I thought what I'd do is recount some of the lessons I've learned from years of screwing up. Last year, I talked about a dozen things on company building, which I will list up here, but will not go through for you. This talk is on our website, so feel free to go back and watch the video. I'll add, last year when I'd done this dozen, and dozen was a convenient, catchy number, I'd actually done 18 more that were after my last slide. So this year I thought I'd go through those next dozen and a half and talk about some of them. Eric Ries talked about it. Most of this pertains to management in startups, which really is about management in extreme uncertainty. It is completely irrelevant to what big companies or business schools teach you because of this factor of extreme uncertainty. I was talking to Michael Bonner, who served out that great candy last night, and I said, how do you know in your first quarter whether you'll sell 2 million pounds of candy or 20? So his management job is not to make a forecast. It's to be ready to respond rapidly. And frankly, he couldn't tell me if it was going to be 2 million pounds, which would be $2 million, or 20 million pounds because he's in 40,000 stores. And I can make an argument for either. So that's the special perspective. Big, hairy, audacious goals are great. You can't do anything extraordinary without daring to be great. You have to have audacious goals. BHAG is a term many of you have heard. But you have to have a backup plan. I love ambitious plans, but that have plateaus. If you're going to ascend Everest, you do establish base camp, a place from which you can learn the environment before you start your assault on Everest. It looks something like this. And think of your business as doing an ambitious plan and being able to roll back into worse than the worst case plan, which most of you will need to do for some period of time. And when you do that, please don't give up on the big, hairy, audacious goal. Because people cut back, license out the stuff they're not going to do because they're retrenching. Don't. Keep that upside. John Herring talked about this. Think big, act small. You have to have a BHAG, but you can't achieve it in one step. Think of every step you'll need to take. With your limited resources, you can build a billion-dollar company if you get $1 or $2 at every step. You can't get $1 billion in revenue overnight. So this think big, be schizophrenic, act small, absolutely key. But there's one other piece that's important, which is this thing about having the courage of your convictions. John Herring talked about passing on Verizon. Samir didn't mention at Keyur last year, just before the IPO, we passed on something that would have been $1 billion of revenue a year. We had the courage of our convictions to say, we'll come back and renegotiate this because we will have a better negotiating position. Deepak would be proud. We walked away. Burn is the other thing. And Eric talked about this flat curve and then this big expansion, that exponential. Susie, could you grab me a bottle of water? Most people manage their burn based on their plan, based on first quarter, second quarter, third quarter. Exactly the wrong way to manage burn. Manage it. Thanks a lot. Manage it on risk triggers, not time triggers. When you achieve, I guess there's water behind me. When you achieve risk reduction, that's when you want to increase your burn, not when you reach the quarter or the time milestone. And there are incredible number of opportunities for risk trade-offs that people don't think about. You can increase your engineering staffing, reduce your risk of engineering schedule, and increase your financial risk. You could spend more on marketing and do less engineering, and you take on more engineering risk and less marketing risk. But you might take more financial risk, or you may cut back and reduce your financial risk. It depends on the circumstance. So to me, at these risk reduction inflection points, if you look back, whether it's 4 quarters, 8 quarters, 12 quarters, or 12 years, that's what your burn rate should look like. At every risk reduction point, you get to the next plateau of burn. Here's also another very important thing. I get asked this question. When do you use process and when do you use instinct? Very hard trade-off to make. Tied in this is another very complex issue. Many of you are founders. Founders have great instinct. Managers know how to manage process. If you're going to scale, you need both. I have one piece of advice. If a founder can scale, it's much better for a company to have a founder CEO, if they can manage process. And I told this little story about John Herring. 3 years ago, I would have said to, in fact, I said to him, he had no chance of being CEO. We probably would need a CEO. But he built such a strong operating team around him. He's grown up so well that he may have been, this may have been first real job. He'd actually started a company before, but he was 23 when he started Lookout. He's grown up to be a really great CEO. He's had people who institute process, and he's kept his creativity, his instinct, and his openness to ideas. And that's a perfect situation, but doesn't always work. It also depends on what your burn rate is. If you're burning $3 million a year, you've got lots of room to experiment, to use instinct. If you're burning $30 million a year, you need process. You need to do things differently. And the biggest flexibility you lose as an entrepreneur, way more than you realize, when you increase your burn, is you lose the ability to experiment and play. The analogy I give to people is when you have a low burn rate, think of yourself at one of these British roundabouts. We have a pretty big British contingent here. There may be 6 roads going off in directions. It's okay. And most VCs hate me for saying this because I say this at board meetings. It's okay to go around in circles for a while. My view. Many people will disagree. And scope out each road before you decide which one you pick. Because once you pick a road, you will end up where that road leads. And don't pick it too early. Try the experiments. Try small failures. I'll talk more about that. It's a beautiful place to be early in a company, but you can only do it if your burn rate is really low, where 6 months of extra time isn't going to hurt you in terms of your ability to finance the company. I also see a couple of mistakes made in people being too economic. I was really cheap when I was an entrepreneur. In fact, at the end of the first year, I got this great gift box at our first year anniversary party. Inside was a sharp pencil, a cheap sharp pencil. I felt like I was way too cheap and lost too much time and too much opportunity. Because we were ready to scale, and I was afraid to press on the gas. So managing to a plan can be a bad thing. I'll come back to plans. But there's also the flip side. You can be too early. And Eric Ries talked about this. It's amazing how many things I recognize from all the speakers who were speaking. You can't predict when that hockey stick will happen. You have to nibble at its edges to decide when you're ready to press on the gas. You maybe need to go around that roundabout a few more times. And Dan Gardner talked about this also. Remember, this is about managing an extreme uncertainty. People take the view that either they won't make errors, the hedgehog strategy, or they have, as Rob Burton talked about, extreme certainty about their views, and most entrepreneurs are. Much better to make a plan that can be changed rapidly. You design an organization. So I often get asked when I give my forecasting talk, if you can't forecast, what do you do? You can optimize an organization to execute on a plan. Or you can optimize an organization for maximum flexibility. In the face of extreme uncertainty, I suggest you optimize for adaptability and flexibility, not for execution on one particular plan. And it's a really important trade-off. It never gets talked about. It's key. You also won't do anything extraordinary unless you're unreasonable about what you're trying to do. George Bernard Shaw said, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Martin Luther King said, human progress depends on the socially maladjusted. Those are two keywords for me. Maybe I'm socially maladjusted, and I like that vindication. But willingness to fail is very, very important. Quickly, often, more importantly, keeping the consequences of each failure small. And iterate your way to success. Don't plan your way to success. It almost never works. Almost never works. I always say the single biggest reason I feel I've been successful when I have been successful is because of my willingness to fail. And my willingness to adapt quickly when I fail. Some people get frustrated with me, say, 3 months ago you said strategy X, now you're talking about Y. It is important when you take risks to fail quickly and in small ways and keep the consequences of each failure small. Another one of my beefs. Probably the single most important advice I'll give you other than about people. So I should call it the second most important piece of advice. All of you look for advice. You tend to look for advice from people who are convenient. People around you, people you know, people you trust. They may not be qualified to give you advice. Whose opinion to trust and on what topic, and on each topic there's somebody different you need to trust, is the second most important decision after people that entrepreneurs make. And it is almost never made explicitly. It's done implicitly. So please pay attention. This is pretty common. You have this illusion of control when you make a plan with a hockey stick and Eric Ries referred to this. You assume in the flat portion, and most companies beat their plan when the revenue line is supposed to be zero and they're controlling expenses. Almost most companies, and they're very proud. Part of that, they assume that when the hockey stick comes, they have control over that too, because just like they have control over expenses. The revenue side, you have very little control. Your customers do. The expense side, you control. So you have to get rid of this optimism bias, hope. And the worst, and we've seen it in some of our own companies, when the spin they use with investors also becomes internal, and everybody in the company starts believing their own spin. Major failure mode for startups. There are things you can do. Maybe the most important is to find honest friends. As Mark Leslie said, if you want a friend, get a dog. If you want to build a great company, get the most critical advice you can get. Many people here know I can be fairly critical, but I only do that because that's what helps you in a way that you can respond to. Having friends say nice things, and most people are inclined to say nice things, they won't tell you where you're wrong, is very, very dangerous for startups. I've seen this error often. The other failure mode I've seen, especially with people with experience, this is why I think younger entrepreneurs tend to have less experience, higher probability of success, because experience, and I include myself in this, really means a bias. We have a lot of learning. We develop a set of biases based on that, and we are less open to new ideas. And that's why younger entrepreneurs tend to be much more creative and innovative and try new things. Whenever I hear a CEO say, we tried that 10 years ago, it failed, or 20 years ago, I can tell you before Facebook, when I was at Kleiner, we funded Friendster. Was that proof that the Facebook model doesn't work? No, it just proves we screwed up at Friendster. Just because something has failed, maybe because you did it poorly, maybe it wasn't the right time, maybe the environment has changed. The number of plans that have been tried before, didn't work, are now working is large. So this, I got lots of experience, I tried this 100 times, is also a common failure mode. Especially when you consider the talk on being certain. We tend to be certain. Customers don't know what they want. Focus groups are the worst way to do startups. That's why this minimum viable product idea actually works. When you present real opportunities to buy, people make very different decisions than when you don't. A famous example I use, I got to know Bill Gates originally in the 80s. We'd hang out at this conference called PC Forum. Every lunchtime, they do a survey of what flavor of ice cream people wanted at the 5 o'clock Mixer social. Almost always the number one pick was frozen yogurt. It was also the least consumed product at 5 o'clock. Heath Bar Crunch from Ben & Jerry's was the number one product. What people think they want and the decision they make when faced with choices are very, very different. That's why the MVP strategy works. One of the best strategies I saw was Bill Gross actually did this when he started his car selling company. He built the front screens. And literally, when you got to the 10th screen to buy a car, he'd say, oops, sorry, this is just a test. He just built the screens to first find out how customers would react. Not hypothetically if they asked them if they want to buy a car on the internet. As Ben Silberman told you, they don't know. You don't know how people will respond. You, as experts, don't know. You can guess at it and try lots of small iterations. That's why failing in small ways is important. Pundits, for sure, don't know. You heard that from Dan Gardner. Hopefully, I'll also weave together the purposes for each of these talks you heard. So you have to know when to listen and how keenly to listen for signs of the coming future. That's why experimentation is so valuable. That's why going around in circles in that hypothetical roundabout is so important. The key, then, to make progress is to lower the cost of experimentation. The faster you can experiment, whether you're building a fuel injector or an engine, or you're doing a chemical process, or you're building a website, the faster you can experiment, the faster you'll learn, the faster you'll make progress. Give up any hope of knowing in advance how you're going to develop a product. It doesn't matter whether you're doing a biofuel or you're building a website. Assume lots and lots of small iterations with rapid feedback. There are exceptions, and I won't go into all of them, but generally more true, even when there are exceptions, lowering the cost of trying an idea within a company means you'll try many more ideas, and you learn much more and optimize much better. Very important way to run a company. I often ask you, for those of you who know me, how do you increase the rate of experimentation by 10x? And the reason I use 10x is a very clever ploy. Whenever I say, how do you increase the rate of experimentation by 2x, the answer I almost always get is, I need twice as many people. When I say 10x, nobody ever says I need 10 times the number of people. They suddenly get creative. They're forced to think about more creative ways to increase the rate of experimentation. I've essentially talked about plans and flexi plans. Really, planning is not a valuable exercise. Business plans are worthless, other than for one thing. Oops, I'm sorry. Plans are valuable to make sure, first, I look at plans only to see the quality of thinking of the entrepreneur, not to see what they'll actually do. How critically are they thinking about their problem? How much are they trying to identify all the possible risks? How they're looking at things they don't know. But in the end, startups are about being adaptable, about being reactive, about being agile. And building plans you believe in is possibly the worst thing you can do, other than for the reason I mentioned. The other thing people like to do, almost everybody likes to hire in their own image. People like them. I have a paper on the website called Gene Pool Engineering. You probably have copies of it. I think they were handed out. Maybe they weren't. It is important to engineer diversity of thinking. This little company we have in New Zealand, LanzaTech, a biofuels company hired a disk drive engineer because there weren't too many different types of engineers. Guess what? Suddenly, the surface properties of every wall became an input into the experimentation that they hadn't thought about. Because what do you do in disk drives? Design surface properties to store more bits. Diversity helps in unusual ways, and the more diverse you can be with really smart people, the better off you will be. And then it's nice to have managed conflict. I'll talk about tension in a minute. Managed conflict between different points of view with people from different backgrounds is very, very important to surfacing your risks early. And the sooner you surface your risks, the sooner you will address them. There are cultures where nobody wants to speak their mind. The founder or CEO is so strong, you get a cover-up culture. Or you get authority entitlement. I'm the VP, I make this decision. And other people don't speak up. I have a paper on recruiting on our website too, which is about how do you interview a person. If you're a technical founder, just started a company, you're hiring a VP of marketing, you have no clue how to hire a VP of marketing. And that paper is about how do you go about hiring a sales guy or a marketing guy if you've never actually seen a great VP. And the person you ask may have the title of VP marketing in another startup, but he may not be a good VP of marketing. That's why this question of whose opinion you trust. But one of the more important things I ask you to ask in this paper of any interview is, you're the VP of marketing, how will you make my VP of engineering better? How will you push my VP of finance? Every critical hire should stretch every other executive. Don't think functional hiring. I'm not a fan of functional hiring where you optimize a VP of engineering for the VP of engineering function. You optimize your senior team to surface ideas, to have managed conflict, have lots of debates, find your risks early, find your opportunities early, and then you can act on them. I need to go a bit faster. I talked about tension. There is tension between rapid innovation and excellent execution. Deal with it. People bias one way or the other. There is a healthy balance. It's different in each situation. If you're building a $200 million plant, you want to be towards the excellent execution side. If you're building a $2 million website, you want to be on the rapid innovation. But healthy tension between these is important to company culture. It's also important to have some tension between effective teamwork and high-performance people who tend to be socially maladjusted. Find a way to suck the best out of them. Sometimes they get extreme, kick them out. But most of the time, try and use them for what they're good at. And they are socially maladjusted. There's a good book on emotional intelligence. The brighter person somebody is, the less likely they are to have it. There are schools that try and counter that. But high-performance people and effective teamwork are often in conflict. Deal with it. Everybody reads their strengths pretty well. Misreading your liabilities can hurt your plan as much as knowing your strengths, or way more. Most people design their business plans to optimize for their strengths. Very few people design their business plans to minimize the impact of their liabilities. Really critical, you consider both. Like I said, if you want a friend, you want people to say good things, get a dog. It is catastrophic when you misread your liabilities. Very few people go look for what their competitors are saying about them. Very few boards look for that outside input. I wish everybody appointed somebody just to get input on all the ways people outside the company think the company may fail or is not as strong as their competitors. Would be wonderful if one of the key executives was assigned that task. Important to understand, very few people do. So read the tweets. With all the social media, it's so easy to find out what others think. One of my favorite company sites, it's now shut down, was a site called fuckedcompany.com. If your employees thought you weren't doing well, they'd go post on that site. It was a great place to see where your companies were doing poorly. And maybe it was a disgruntled employee, you can rationalize it away, but look for valuable feedback in all the media. to get honest feedback, because the sooner you understand honest feedback, the better you'll be able to respond to it. Doesn't feel comfortable, you don't want to talk to. I often tell entrepreneurs, even if you're not looking for funding, go pitch 6 VCs and see why they don't like your company. You'll learn a lot. And then you can say, oh, no, I'm not raising any money. Not to us. Don't do that to us. Don't waste our time. But it is a great way to find out all the ways people who've seen a lot of startups think you might fail. Jack Dorsey talked about this. And I mentioned yesterday, real values are different than value statements. Value statements are usually a bunch of bullshit, usually marketing bullshit. Real values are when you institute them. And you see that in Square as you walk in. And I know that some of the Square employees don't like the value system of, hey, put your chair back in. That's okay. Just ask them to leave. You want everybody in the company subscribing to your culture. Also, reward behaviors and skills that are compatible with your real values. If your real values aren't actionable, they don't matter. Jack talked about this. Make actionable real values. And reward the behaviors that are compatible and punish the behaviors that are not compatible with your values. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. That's obvious. Dave Lloyd talked about this. Passion for a vision and audacious goals, but reflect them in your value system. Have the courage to follow your culture and your values. If you're John Herring, it's okay to pass on Verizon. As silly as everybody else will think it is, if it's not compatible with your vision, you will get another shot at it. I gave you the Cure example early. It takes a lot of courage to do it. And courage, only the word courage doesn't mean anything till you're scared. There is no courage if you're not scared. Think about that. So the only time you need courage is when it's scary. So, on to the single most important thing. I will tell you, none of you focus enough on people. None of you. Every one of you says so, none of you does. So I'm going to go through more thoughts on people. I think a good CEO should spend 50% of their time on recruiting, especially when their company is growing. Very few do. I look back at Sun, and I probably spent between 30 and 40%. For every competitor, by calling around, I developed an org chart. I knew the top 200 execs by name at Digital Equipment, at HP, at every Sun competitor. I knew what they had done. I did that myself. I talked to each one of them about every other. I knew what they thought of each other better than they did in their own company, because I'd call an executive, cold call, and say, you interested in a job? Talk to us. Oh, by the way, what do you think of that guy? So I sort of had this map of opinions of every one of my competitors' key executives. This is another mistake. Oh, I only need 6 people, so I'll hire the engineers and go execute. That's probably okay. But the 7th person you need to hire, guess who's going to interview that 7th person? The first 6. If they're not impressive, do you think a really great person will want to join the team? Teams become self-fulfilling. After about 50 people, and I think somebody talked about this, you can't change the gene pool. It sort of gets into the organization in ways you can't shift it. And every new employee coming in is recruited by the people you have. if you have the wrong people, don't have them interview the new person. Because even if you sell them, your employees can unsell them if they aren't high-performance people that you just got because you had to get people in a hurry to get your product out. It is catastrophic when you have an organization that the best people don't want to join because they're not impressed with it. Goes the seventh person that way, and the eighth is, and becomes harder and harder because the really great people come in and say, is this my peer group? I don't want to be part of this. I've seen this often. Don't get caught up in titles. That's sort of obvious, but there's a more important half to that. I've said this to some of you, maybe many of you. If you see a great person, create a damn title. Great people are worth getting. I've asked you, create a division, call him president of the new division, just because you want that person. You don't let an org chart get in the way. Go out, find the best people, get them on board, find whatever excuse you can to distort the organization to get the right people on board. Engineer diversity. It is hard. I asked one of my CEOs, how many PhDs do you have? Which is clean tech startup, PhDs count, appropriate number, say 15 or 20. I said, how many under the age of 35? Answer, 0. Very little diversity. All experienced in their area, they will propound the old conventional wisdom. There's nobody to challenge them. Somebody fresh out of MIT will say, oh, have you tried this? Who hasn't yet figured out that bias around all the things that don't work, that he might be willing to try again. Diversity by age, diversity by industry, diversity by country, they all add up to a better company. Number of times people tell me, I don't have a budget for that extra great person. That's never the case. They will contribute whether you need them or not if they're really, really great. So get them on board, create a title, create a division, create a general manager, whatever you need to do. Most of the time, and there are a few exceptions, and you can't get financing, and you're trying to save every penny, 99% of the time you're not in that position for that great person. There's also, for founders and CEOs, two different models of managing. I call them the shepherd model and the sergeant model. The sergeant model is when you are executing, everybody's going in lockstep towards a goal. If you think about what I said earlier, try lots of experiments, fail quickly, try new things. It's not compatible with the sergeant model of execution. The shepherd model works very well. If you look at a herd of sheep, you can see sheep going backwards, sideways, in all directions. But the herd is being herded generally in a direction. Guess what happens? They're not marching down the road. They're going through the pasture, finding the greenest pasture, zigging left, zagging right. That's what herds do well. That shepherd style is much more appropriate in the early stages of companies, especially when they don't have to deliver quarters to Wall Street. Important distinction. Important to have no management before its time. You can't have too much process too early. This seems obvious. Amazing how often very few people focus on the things that really matter. Equally importantly, many fewer things really matter than you think. When you do a functional org chart, you think the marketing matters, the engineering matters, the sales matters. Usually at any given time, there's only 2 or 3 things that will change the outcome for the company. Focus all your attention on that. It's one of the reasons I don't go on boards anymore. What I do is do reviews with most of you, and I say, what are the 2 or 3 questions that are most important for this company? And let's just spend 3 hours on those. In a board meeting, they get lost. One of the things you noticed when Keith Rabois talked, he talked about 2 minor issues, 1 or 2 major issues at every board meeting. That is where you want feedback. That's where you want discussion. That's where you want an outside point of view. And those very few things are what you should focus on. And there's a paper on our website written by somebody at INSEAD called Effectual Reasoning, What Entrepreneurs Do. Entrepreneurs don't build a plan and then say, here's the resources I need a plan. You sort of think you do. You pretend to. You create this illusion of planning that way. But in fact, what this paper is about, and he surveyed about 200 very successful entrepreneurs, is entrepreneurs say, what are the resources I have, and say, what's the next step I can take towards the tip of Mount Everest, given what I have? You start small, you go with what you have, you don't give up the Everest goal. This is another version of think big, act small. Use effectual reasoning. It's a good paper. I highly recommend it. Next, real feedback, hard to get for CEOs. And when you give it to people, it has to be fast, actionable, scalable, and candid. The worst thing you can do is say, great job, when you don't think so. One of the statements that's on our website since 2004 is, I prefer brutal honesty to hypocritical politeness. 99% of the time, you will get hypocritical politeness from people. Try and stamp it out of your culture. It can be constructive. It can be delivered in a nice way. Sometimes I forget to do that. But make it honest, brutally honest. As CEOs and founders, reward failure in addition to success if it's the right kinds of failure, if that's the culture, if that's the team you're trying to build. I used to, a long time ago, hand out this book to every CEO I ever invested in during my Kleiner days. CEOs almost always make, and founders, they're the same thing, make most decisions too late. As VCs, we talk about it in our partners meeting, we're always late. This is a great quote from Andy Grove. So with that, let me define the CEO's job. Sunday night, be proactive. Most CEOs spend their time reacting all week. If you decide those few things that are important, decide on Sunday night how you're going to spend enough time on them. That's being proactive instead of reacting to every email or phone call request or interruption. If 50% of your calendar is not free on Sunday night for the coming week, you cannot be proactive. You will be reactive. I bet you most of you don't have that. Take those few things I said were really critical to your success and ask yourself brutally, and try and minimize that list. Can you chop down marketing as critical? What's really going to affect your outcome? Whatever it is you need to do for the next 90 days, that next small step. Put your priorities on that and not be reactive to every request you get. That, and having the courage of your convictions to stick with your vision, is what a CEO's job is. To make that Verizon decision, whatever it is, have the courage. And remember again, there is no courage without being scared. Let me skip past that a number of speakers talked about this. Be obstinate about your vision. But that doesn't mean you have to be obstinate about your tactics. People often confuse the two. You can even iterate around your vision, but what you're passionate about is what you should be delivering. So, let me finish by saying the reason Dan Gardner was important is that experts extrapolate the past. Entrepreneurs invent the future. They invent the future they want. And that's why entrepreneurs are key to making the world go forward. Thank you all very much. We actually have a few minutes. We do need to head up to the tent. Just a quick explanation. Our limited partners, our LPs, will be there. So please feel free to join them for lunch. We spend 3 hours with them. Our CEOs are much more important, so we spend a day and a half. We spend 3 hours with our LPs. Don't tell them I said that. Please mix with them. We will have an LP meeting this afternoon, but you get to share lunch with them, hear Tony Blair speak at lunch, and then you can go off on your way. Feel free to join dinner tonight. It's optional. We have a great speaker, Jeff Ma, of fame of the Bringing Down the House fame. Since we do have a few minutes, I'll take 2 questions if people have questions for me. I know if you have any questions. No question. Oh, there's a question there. Vivek?
Getting good people takes a lot of time. And to build, when you're in a growth phase, you have to hire people because you're growing so fast. Maybe you need more developers or product managers. And getting people takes a lot of time. So how do you balance that? In
the trade-off between hiring people that you need and building product, I'd always err in favor of hiring people, not building product. It's false economy. You'll get to your next product milestone faster. 6 months later, you'll be much further behind. So that's a no-brainer to trade off in favor of hiring people. The only exception being, don't be in a hurry if the people aren't great. Remember, my first 6 people interview all your other people, and every new employee looks at which team they're joining. If it's not an awesome initial team, awesome people won't join. Remember that caveat, but other than that, focus on hiring. Last question. I'll take it from Mark, and Debbie, I'll go with you since you're authorized to ask questions. Mark, go ahead.
When you co-founded Sun, approximately how many people did you hire the first year in operation?
Let me see if I can remember. The first year, we had a very fast start. I think we got to about 40 people in our first year. But let me tell you a story that I think is very, very important. I was actually, one of the secrets to my life has been I've never actually interested in business. I've never been interested in business. I do it because it lets me indulge my passion for new technology and doing cool things. So the business side supports my hobby, which is really what I enjoy. How does that relate to your question? I gave you a direct answer, but there's a more important answer. The first 15 people we hired have since probably started 20, 25 companies. Think about the caliber of people we had to hire. I was 25 or something. Eric Schmidt was one of our hires. Bill Joy was one of our hires. So many companies have been started out of the first 15 people. I get this argument from other people saying we don't need that expert. I classically remember we hired a database person. we weren't even close to building a database. It was just a great guy out of Xerox PARC, where all the great computer scientists hung out in those days. I said, that guy's awesome. We got to hire him. Everybody said, why don't we're never going to do databases. Why do you need a database person? I said, he's a great person. We hired him. And remember what I said about hire great people even if you don't need them? I don't think the network file system became the first large hallmark of Sun would have happened if we hadn't thought databases and file systems for those of you computer geeks. But great people are never too expensive or never not needed. Debbie, you get to ask the last question.
So you talked about how important the first 6, 7 people are. What if you're the CEO that comes in and those first 7, 10, 15 people are already there and they're not the people that you want? What's your advice?
So I think I referred to the fact that don't let awesome people you want to hire meet the other people or get rid of the other people. Look, you set up the gene pool of a company very early. They do all the subsequent hiring. If you had the wrong start, start again. Set yourself back 6 months, 9 months, doesn't matter. You'll more than make up the time over the next 5 years if you can build an awesome team. Thank you all very much, and let's head up to the tent.